And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
And welcome to Mob Talk. I am your host, Jeff Canarsie, and we are doing the Q&A show today. We had a ton of questions. I'm probably not going to get to all of them. Some of them I can answer. Some of them I just won't answer, just based on mutual respect for people either I know or et cetera, et cetera. My job is never to out anybody that may be doing anything that's not on the up and up, and I'm not going to start doing that, and I never will do that. So if anybody asks, questions as far as who's running this today and that today, it's just not going to happen. I'm not going to talk about that. You can easily do the research yourself for something like that. What else is going on? We are doing Angelo Bruno tomorrow. That will be out tomorrow. This may be out tonight. Not sure yet. But as far as Angelo Bruno goes, that'll be a pretty good show. We're getting lots of hits, lots of compliments and stuff like that. The blog is taking off. So some people have asked a couple of questions, and I just wanted to address that right at the top before I take a break and we come back and get to the Q&A. As far as where Mob Talk is going, at this point, it's going to stay the way it is for now. Eventually, we're going to move to a website, which will probably be split with the True Crime page. And realistically, there's going to be some live events, some interviews coming. There's a lot of stuff coming on, and I don't want to get into too many details, only because some of these things may be solidified, some of them may not, and I don't really want to, put words in anybody else's mouth as far as, guests and stuff like that. But we have people coming, we have things going on. There is a lot going on. Eventually, we're going to move to some documentary type of stuff, but that's a ways off, and that's going to be predetermined on a couple other things. So we do have some interesting stuff coming up. For those that want to follow me on Twitter, it's at RealMobTalk7, or you can check me out on Facebook. Obviously at Mob Talk Radio, just type it into the search bar. Also, there is the Mob Talk Radio True Crime blog, which is all up-to-date information on true crime, the mafia, and et cetera, et cetera. All your Philadelphia stuff will be there, too. But yeah, that's pretty much where things are at the moment. There was something that I needed to say, and I cannot for the life of me think of it at this very moment. But needless to say, the radio show will progress into something a little different. We are definitely going to start taking live callers and do a live show. That's going to take some tinkering, only because I have to figure out, when the base of my volume is going to be around. I don't want to do a show at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Everybody's at fucking work. So I think at the end of the day, it's probably going to look something like a Friday night or a Saturday night from 7 to 9, 2-hour show. First half an hour, news and notes, and then the rest of the time will be allotted for live call-in questions and et cetera, which I'm sure will be entertaining, because I'm sure all the people that love me and send me wonderful compliments every fucking day of the week are going to really chomp at the bit to get me on the phone and scream at me, because that's what they like to do. All that being said, we're going to cover the Q&A today, and that's, I think, it. So if you're looking for as far as a Philadelphia Mafia update, you're going to catch that tomorrow in the first 10 or 15 minutes of the Angelo Bruno show, and that should be out, I would imagine, sometime around 2 or 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. All that being said, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to get to your questions. Stay tuned. And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. I am your host, Jeff Canarsie, and these are your question and answer sessions. For anybody that does want to submit a question, all you have to do is go to Twitter at RealMobTalk7 and inbox me, or simply go over to Facebook at Mob Talk Radio and inbox me there, or just whatever it's posted on the Mob Talk Radio page on Facebook, just drop a line underneath. I did want to say hello to Slim Jim Phantom. For those of you who don't know, he's the drummer from the Stray Cats. Recently followed me on Twitter and sent me a couple messages. He's a really good guy, solid guy, one of my heroes. So it's kind of cool to have fans or people that enjoy the show from different walks of life, obviously, but especially when it's somebody you greatly admire. That's absolutely phenomenal. If you're unfamiliar with who Slim Jim Phantom is, go on Facebook, go on YouTube, type in Slim Jim Phantom, and check out his music. Obviously, everybody knows who the Stray Cats are, so I don't have to explain that. So all that being said, we're going to get to the questions here. Once again, if I don't get to your question, it's not because your question wasn't important. It's just that I got 300 of them. And, I obviously can't sit here for 4 hours answering every single one of them. And a lot of them are based similarly on the same type of stuff anyhow. So, as far as everything goes, like I said, if I don't get to it, maybe I'll get to it next time. And there will be some questions that I'll at least read, but I won't answer, which will probably upset a lot of people. But my business isn't to put other people's business out there. And there's research that you can do to find maybe perhaps the answer to your question, but I'm not going to be the one to give it. It's nothing has anything to do with fear, despite what some people are going to say. It's just a respect thing. And that's as far as it goes. So what we're going to do is we're going to start first with John Laru, who's got a great name, by the way, especially if you're a SCTV fan. Johnny Laru with John Candy was fantastic. Anyway, how did Frank Sheeran stay under the radar for so long, having been involved in some of the most high-profile events? One of the reasons why Frank Sheeran was able to stay under the radar, and really, he wasn't able to stay under the radar. He was always on the FBI's top list he was ranked the highest associate in the mafia ever. The FBI very well knew who he was. They just couldn't really get anything to stick. I think also the fact that he was aligned with Russell Bufalino sort of insulated himself enough, especially with Bufalino's political power. It was able to sort of keep Sheeran down on the list. And if you don't know who Frank Sheeran is, there is a movie with Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, directed by Martin Scorsese, The Irishman, that is filming in New York as we speak. It's a story of Frank Sheeran, who is responsible for killing Jimmy Hoffa and responsible for killing Joey Gallo and a bunch of other people. So if you have not read that book, the book is called I Heard You Paint Houses. Check it out. There's lots of stuff on Frank Sheeran on YouTube and et cetera, including an interview he did on his deathbed. But essentially, he was able to stay off the radar because he was intelligent. Two, he was relatively unknown outside a certain circle, but he was known for painting houses, which was a reference for essentially killing people. But I think realistically, at the end of the day, he was always on the FBI's radar. They just weren't able to catch him, and I think a lot of that is because he did what we call in the streets clean work. He didn't leave any chance for anything, and he just did what he was told and was good at what he did, and that's really the extent of it. In fact, after Hoffa was killed, the FBI had a list of suspects that they really wanted to interview, or likely suspects that killed Jimmy Hoffa, and Frank Sheeran was at the top of that list. So hopefully that answers that question. But like I said, if you're interested in Frank Sheeran, you can definitely look him up. It's a very good read. The book especially is a very good book, and there's a lot of information about Frank Sheeran out there. Spencer John Lanners, the most greedy mob boss ever. Greed is one of those things. We go back to Joe Massaria. Profaci was notoriously greedy. When you think of greed, I have a tendency of breaking it down a couple different ways. All right. Greed can be money, greed can be power, greed can be influence, greed can be a lot of different things. So when I saw this question originally, I'm like, wow, Joe Massaria, that's why he got killed. He was greedy. But I think realistically, I want to round off greed a little bit. And for me, greed is money, power, influence, etc. And I think the greediest bunch of them, the greediest one I can think of just off the top of my head, is Vito Genovese. Vito Genovese, if you look historically at what he did, convicted drug trafficker, really wanted to be the boss of bosses, had his hand in some really nefarious things, totally brought the idea of killing Albert Anastasia to Carlo Gambino so that they could split families, and Gambino could take over Anastasia's position and call it the Gambino family, and then obviously Genovese trying to take out Costello by using Vincent Gigante, then he could make that the Genovese crime family. I think he's the most greedy, and I say that because it was never enough. Never enough for him. He essentially orchestrated the assassination of Anastasia, orchestrated the assassination or the attempted assassination of Frank Costello, and so he gets to take over control of what we know now is the Genovese crime family, which originally was the Luciano crime family. And essentially that wasn't enough. He called a meeting at Apalachen, and we all know how that went, because he wanted to be recognized by everyone there that he was the boss, and he wanted to be the boss of bosses. So I think his greed particularly went to the extent of he was power hungry, and nothing was enough for him. Now, coming in at a close second, and maybe almost tied for first, probably realistically, maybe Joe Bonanno or maybe Joe Profaci. It just depends, but I think for my money's worth, I think Genovese is was the most greedy one. William Serio, who is the most powerful mob boss in the United States today? Guess what? To answer that question, you can fairly look that up on your own. I just don't want to get into really the facets of who possibly. I definitely have a very good idea, but I'm not comfortable going there. I just don't want to go down that road. So you can look that up for yourself. Okay, John Laru has another question. Who were some of the bosses outside of New York and Chicago who sat on the commission throughout the mob's so-called golden era? Well, Meyer Lansky was one. He was Jewish, obviously, we know this, but he was very well respected by the Italians, very crafty, very intelligent. He was not known as the mob's accountant for no reason. He was a money machine and a money maker, and he was also very deadly, too. Ray Patriarca from the New England crime family, the Patriarca crime family, rooted in Providence, Rhode Island. He was on the commission as well as Russell Buffalino, had a lot of say in what happened, and a lot of people don't understand maybe the reasoning why Ray was in the position he was. One, he was friends with Carlo Gambino. They went way back. Ray was highly intelligent. He was a organizer by nature, and I think that he was just well respected by the rest of the group, and therefore it always helped to have outside opinions other than, say, the five crime families of New York. Russell Buffalino with his political contacts, definitely. And even after Frank Costello effectively was rendered on the shelf, he still participated in commission meetings because people respected his opinion. So those are a couple of the guys that were definitely on the commission, other than Chicago and New York, during the golden era of the mob. Joel Titterod, is Mob Talk Radio still available on iTunes or just YouTube? Okay, here's the deal. I explained this once before, but I don't mind going into it again. I was on Wildfire Radio at one point, and for the most part, we had a disagreement. I'm not going to get into all of it, but there is some old episodes that are on iTunes through Wildfire Radio. They won't take them down. Sort of a disagreement, and I haven't put new stuff up on iTunes because I don't want two pages. One, this is Wildfire Radio, Mob Talk Radio, and then the other one saying Mob Talk Radio, Mob Talk Radio. So for now, they're on YouTube. That will be changed. I'm not sure the format that I will go with that. However, it definitely will be changing at some point. But for now, just on YouTube. Richard Smith, had Gambino named Della Croce as boss rather than Castellano, how do you think the following 9 years would have played out for the Gambinos, and do you think Neil would have given the throne to Gotti? The first part of that, I can definitely answer. Second part is fairly easy, too. Had John Gotti waited, Castellano would have ended up going to prison for 100 years, okay, in the commission case. Not to mention, there was the auto theft ring that Roy Demeo was running that caught Castellano in a lot of shit. But at the end of the day, one maybe can make an argument that maybe Gotti didn't need to move. But there are a lot of reasons why the move was supported by a lot of people, and I still get into arguments today with this topic because people say, "Oh, the commission was against it." They weren't. Vito Genovese. Vincent Chinchigante was against it verbally, but for it in other ways, and that's just the bottom line. But as far as Dellacroce should have taken over. He was the underboss for 20 years, relatively didn't do any real time in prison as far as while he was underboss. And in the natural succession of things, Carlo Gambino realistically should have made him boss. He was the rightful person to take over that position. I mean, Paul was a lowly capo at the time. So he really didn't have the experience as far as, or the intelligence for that matter. He was a business guy. He dealt with white-collar crime. He wasn't really a violent guy by nature. He did order murders, et cetera, et cetera. However, had Dellacroce not gotten sick and Gambino names him boss, this is a totally different crime family. I still think indictments would have come, but I think that Dellacroce was old school, and I think he would have run it old school, and it would have remained probably a lot more powerful than it ultimately fell after Gotti took over with all those indictments and what Sammy Gravano did. So to kind of round that out, I think that definitely Dellacroce would have been a better boss than Castellano, but I think Carlo Gambino chose Paul not because he had a beef with Dellacroce whatsoever. I just think he wanted to keep the bloodlines. It was his cousin and brother-in-law, and it just made probably more sense to him at that time to just keep it in the family, and that's fine. But ultimately, it ended up getting Castellano killed. And for the second part of the question, would Dellacroce have given Gotti the throne when he found out he was dying? Absolutely. I think that John Gotti, regardless, was going to ascend to the throne, either by force or by nomination. Him and Dellacroce are very incredibly tight, and I just think that Dellacroce had a soft spot for Gotti, and I think he realized Gotti potential in a lot of different ways. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, Gotti would have taken over. It just was more preemptive than probably a lot of people expected. I think the results, I think for those 9 years, if Castellano's not boss and Dellacroce is there, I think it's more of a what are the words I'm looking for? I think the Gambino crime family would have made a lot of money still. I think they would have been highly more organized, and I think that they just would have been a big powerhouse. And I think we're taking the Genovese crime family. They were already number one at that time, as far as I'm concerned. Steep decline once Paul Castellano took over. So I think the family would have profited big time. I think that they would have made a lot more guys. The family would have been a little bigger. But we can't really tell because at the end of the day, we know what really happened. And that's just sort of the reality of that. Signerson Gunnarsson, how did Dellacroce rise to underboss? He reigned for 20 years without getting arrested. Can you enlighten me? Well, Neil Dellacroce was a very scary guy. He was a tough guy. He didn't mind doing a lot of dirty work, and he was an individual who scared the crap out of detectives and FBI agents. He was a no-nonsense guy. But just looking sort of kind of at him for just a brief second, takes over us. And what's really neat about him, neat in the aspect of like lore, is that he used to walk around dressed as a priest and call himself Father O'Neill. And he did that because he wanted the police to sort of just not recognize him for who he was. And if he's a little nice, small a priest, nobody's going to bother him. He also used to kill people while he wore the priest outfit, so that's a little tongue-in-cheek. But one of the other unique things that he used to do is he used to have a body double. He is in the night, and Anastasia ends up being Dellacroce. So he was already in the leadership in the 1950s. Obviously, 65 he becomes underboss. But what happened was when Anastasia got killed, Dellacroce, who was a supporter of Anastasia, he liked Anastasia a lot, and he was old school, and he believed in loyalty, and that the boss is the boss is the boss. And you can listen to wiretaps that are on YouTube of that. The boss is the boss is the boss, he tells John Gotti and Angelo Ruggiero. But what he ends up doing is realizing that he can't fight Carlo Gambino. And so effectively what he ends up doing is giving his support to Carlo Gambino because it just made sense. But it also kind of coincides with, right after Anastasia is whacked. I believe that was in 1957. It's not long after that Delacroce becomes underboss of the Gambino crime family. So it made sense to him. He may have agreed to disagree with what happened to Anastasia, but he also saw the writing on the wall. Robert Wilkins, the most successful labor racketeer. That's a big question. That's a difficult question, only because there's like a million people I could choose. But I think right off the top, the one guy that I would pick in a heartbeat is Anthony. Not just because of the rackets he owned, but he stayed in his area. He was brilliant. He had a high IQ. He knew how to work a racket and then let the proceeds from those rackets work other rackets. And he controlled everything, unions and stuff like that. So I think, is he the most successful? Well, if you look at his bankroll, what's $3 billion, $5 billion, something like that, I would say he was definitely, if not the one, probably one of the ones to being effectively on that list. All right, moving right along. Richard Smith has another question. I think the Philly mob story from Bruno's reign to Merlino's would make a great movie. I'm surprised it hasn't been picked up. I think Joe Pesci would make a great Nicky Scarfo. Your thoughts? I absolutely agree with you. I think I find Nicky Scarfo a little hilarious in certain things. I mean, only Nicky Scarfo could shove a horse off a fucking cliff. And laugh about it. But as far as Joe Pesci goes, yeah, I think he would have been the perfect Arfo. I don't think there's anybody else that can play a mob character like Joe Pesci, especially from a violent aspect. But as far as that idea of the movie, I sort of disagree. I don't think there's... the story of Angelo Bruno is interesting, but Hollywood has a tendency of picking really big crime figures, John Gotti's, your Al Capone's, your Joe Bonanos, and guys that are really... Carlo Gambino, I think, to me, would be a more interesting film than, say, Angelo Bruno. Not because Angelo Bruno wasn't flashy, he was quiet. I just think when you look at Angelo Bruno's reign, Merlino, Philadelphia is just so lopsided in everything that they do. It's sort of like the book in the film, The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. And I laugh about that all the time. But I think I think Joe Pesci could play Nicky Scarfo, but I just think the idea of that movie itself, I don't think would flesh out quite well. As much as I like Joey Merlino, I just don't... I don't think that's really a Hollywood story. It may be. Somebody may see it that way, but I don't. Mike Crimmy says Michael Imperioli is Joey. Yeah, I think so. I think Michael Imperioli is an incredible actor. I've liked a lot of the stuff he's done, his offbeat stuff as well. And he has a little swagger like Joey. I don't think he has swagger like Joey, but I think he could definitely play Joey Merlino. David Fitzgerald, in your opinion, is the Mexican Mafia now as powerful as Cosa Nostra was in the golden years? Absolutely not. And I can say that with 100%. Not that I'm knocking the Mexican Mafia in any kind of way. Not that I could give a shit either. But the Mexican Mafia doesn't have the political power that Cosa Nostra had. And this is going back to the 30s, 40s, 50s, Tammany Hall, and all that kind of... That can even go back as the 5 Points gang, when Irish gangs and Italian gangs completely fucking owned Tammany Hall. So the idea... And we can move ahead of that and say... Frank Costello, same kind of deal. When you own politicians, that makes you more powerful than being able to smuggle drugs across the border. So, in my opinion, I don't think they're as powerful only because they don't have political contacts. And we're talking in the context of the golden era of the mob. So there's just no way. I don't think that the Mexican Mafia has those type of political contacts now. I don't think they ever really will. They're two different types of organizations. And that's just the reality of that. And his second follow-up question was, which brought in the most money, Atlantic City, Vegas, or Cuba? There's going to be some that are going to argue against me. Atlantic City was a moneymaker, but it wasn't nearly as fucking controlled as Las Vegas. Las Vegas at one point was a mob machine. Everybody had their hand in the cookie jar, whereas Atlantic City really wasn't to the extent of Vegas. So it would really come down between Las Vegas and Cuba. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, Las Vegas was probably the biggest moneymaker for the mob. Cuba was huge too, and the reason why Cuba was huge was because they essentially got away with everything in Cuba until Batista lost out and Fidel Castro moved in and overthrew Batista. So I think that Vegas was a huge moneymaker, but it was split between a lot of people, whereas Cuba was essentially split between a couple. and it was mainly the bosses. It wasn't specifically, all people. You go to Vegas, it's Kansas City, Florida, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Las Vegas. You got everybody that's tied into Vegas. So it was split a lot of different ways, whereas Cuba, it wasn't. And Meyer Lansky was the genius behind Cuba. Eric Madero, in one of your previous episodes, you mentioned you talked to or met Dominic Montiglio. What was he like? What's your personal opinion? I have never met Dominic Montiglio. I have spoken to him. I did do an interview that's posted over on the blog, and that was I think a year and a half ago, or not even a year ago yet. He seems to me like, and I'm not going to argue the point of what he did, being an informant. He is a case where, first of all, I don't like informants. Everybody knows this. But he sort of has kind of a special place to me. And I don't like what he did, but I understand what he did perhaps a little bit more than other people do. He had done nothing wrong. He had lived his whole life under the thumb of Nino. And at the end of the day, they were going to kill him over some bullshit. And he had to do what he had to do to save himself and his family. That I totally, completely understand. I don't agree with the testifying against people's stuff. He was in Vietnam. He was a soldier, so I have a spot for him there. I take him as a very tortured guy. There's a couple of people I've talked to. Frank Ganji is one as well. Frank Ganji's a tortured fucking human being. If there's anybody that doesn't like what they did, doesn't like the fact that it ended the way it did, have regrets about testifying, regrets about not taking more action, Frank Ganji is one of those guys as well. But as far as Dominic goes, the way I sort of see him is just he lived an interesting life. He did a lot of things he regrets, and those are the types of things that keep you up at night. So is he a nice guy, a great guy? He's cordial, but I don't know him to the extent that I can really answer that question honestly. And to be honest with you, a lot of people are saying he's no longer alive. He sort of disappeared off Facebook and off social media, so I really don't know. People ask me all the time. I don't have his phone number, so it's not like I can call him up and say, hey, you alive? So I don't have a kind of friendship with him like that, or a relationship with him like that, so I'm not even really sure. But as far as, he seems like an alright guy. He went through some serious stuff, so anytime you do, there's going to be sort of like backlash for that. And but no, he seems pretty personal. Darren Vizard also adds, this is sort of kind of the same question, but I've seen Dominic Montiglio on YouTube and on a few documentaries, especially the one with the reoccurring dreams stands out. But then I saw somebody say he's not the real Dominic. What's the deal? Okay, what the deal is there was a guy pretending to be Dominic Montiglio on Facebook. There are two. One is real, one is fake, and the one that is fake is no longer on Facebook. So I haven't really done I haven't talked to Dominic. I haven't gone to his page or anything. But his post was the last post he made was in June. Nobody's seen him. But there was a fake Dominic out there telling a lot of stories and trying to act the role, but it definitely wasn't him, and the real Dominic put a stop to that. So that's how I can answer that. John Laru, who shot Johnny Torrio? That's easy. Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran effectively shot him. That goes back to the O'Banion Wars. And they essentially did a drive-by on him as he was coming in with packages to his house or groceries to his house. They popped him a bunch of times, and he lived, obviously. But yeah, it was Jaime Weiss and Bugsy Moran are the two that definitely that. We are going to take a quick break. When we come back, we are going to answer more of your questions. Stay And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are answering your questions. Next question comes from John Laru, yet again. One of my favorite names. I love this. Did drug kingpin Frank Matthews have a beef with the mob at one point? If so, what was it about, and was it serious? If you don't know who Frank Matthews is, obviously you can look him up, but I'll give you a little bit of background. He was basically one of the biggest drug distributors and traffickers, really not Pablo Escobar numbers, but he was huge, bigger than Frank Lucas, bigger than, oh Christ, what the hell is his name? Nicky Barnes, but he was a major heroin and cocaine trafficker who operated essentially the eastern seaboard from Florida all the way to Maine. He operated in 21 states in 1971. He hosted a meeting of the black and Hispanic drug dealers throughout the United States to essentially discuss how they could break away from the mafia's control of heroin imports. What they wanted to do effectively was remove the Italians from importing the heroin because they knew that, one, they wouldn't have to pay sort of a tribute to them, and they could import it and get it at a better price. And that is what really started a big problem between Frank Matthews and the mob. So at one point, and this is very reference to The Godfather, and I almost wonder if this is where Scorsese and Puzo took it from, but effectively, Matthews sits down with the Gambinos and the Bonanno crime family, a lot like Sollozzo from The Godfather, and he sort of says, this is what I'm doing, I want to sell drugs, these people will help me, those people will help me, are you on board? And neither the Gambinos or the Bonannos wanted anything to do with Frank Matthews. One of it was because mainly the Gambinos and the Bonannos already had their heroin and the coke coming in through Canada and et cetera, et cetera. They really didn't need a guy who was effectively way out in the open, who was operating very broadly. It just meant trouble for them, and so they weren't willing to sort of deal with him, but they also gave him a stern warning to the extent of, you're going to keep paying your tribute or there's going to be an issue. So in 1973, the DEA effectively moves in to arrest Matthews. They arrest him, and he ends up posting bail and disappears, and he's never seen again. And so the question has always been with a lot of people is, did the mob kill him? I would suspect highly that would be the case, because apparently $20 million was missing from his bank account, between $3 and $20 million, something like that, and he effectively disappeared. Nobody's ever seen him again. I find it hard to believe that he escaped. He did agitate the mafia very much, especially by sitting down and having sort of a commission meeting with all the Hispanic drug dealers and black drug dealers across the United States as a way to try to fuck the Italians out of what they were doing. So that definitely caused a big problem, definitely caused a big beef, and eventually, Frank Matthews disappears, and that's the end of him. Next question. Does George Hogan still run the Irish mob in Boston, and are they still active? To my knowledge, he is no longer in control of the Irish mob. 2012 was sort of the last year that he was in control. Honest to God, I do not know who is in control of the Irish mob in Boston. They are still active, but it's a very, very, very small crew, and they're very subservient to the Italians that are there. Obviously, that would be bits and pieces of the Genoveses, bits and pieces of the Gambinos, and obviously the patriarchal crime family. David LaFleur, Carmine Persik, Ernie Madoff are in prison together. Any stories about them? As far as from what I heard, they have had conversations. They talk and kind of hang out, but that's really it. I don't have anything really absolutely specific about that, but I did read something somewhere, I think it was in the New York Post or the New York Daily News, about that situation. Let's see. Matthew first, can you elaborate on the Family Secrets trial? I would love to, but I got your question at the last possible second, and there's a couple of things that I have on them that a lot of people may not know, and I just didn't have a lot of time to put it together, so I will definitely get back to that one. Let's see. Nick Rada, do you still plan on doing a couple of shows on Chicago you mentioned in earlier episodes? I do. I am going to do a whole series on Chicago, almost from beginning to end. However, I'm going to do it in a little bit of a different way than I'm doing this now, and that's why it's not exactly out yet, because there's something special that's going to go with it. and I want it to be sort of a little bit different. Maybe a documentary, but maybe I haven't figured out exactly what I'm going to effectively do with that yet, but it is coming. I have a lot of different projects as far as that goes, so just be patient with me, and I'll try. A lot of Chicago, man, what is it with you guys from Illinois? Oh, man, every day, do the mob, do Al Capone. Well, it's all coming. It's just that, I have a list that sits on my desk, and it has a list of things guys I'm going to cover, and et cetera, et cetera. So Al Capone's on the list. There's some others on the list. But sometimes I look at who I'm supposed to be covering next week. I go, I don't want to talk about this guy. Let me do somebody different. And that's what happened with Johnny Torrio. Roy Demeo. Where do gangsters get their guns? Same place everybody else does. There's a black market for everything. I don't think they go to Sears and Roebuck or Kmart or Walmart or what have yous and buy a gun legitimately, because the majority of people that are involved in organized crime are felons, at least to some extent, not all, some. So the idea of owning a firearm legally just doesn't happen. That's a 5-year sentence right off the bat if you get caught with one, for a firearms conviction being a felon. So listen, guns are easy to get. They're always going to be easy to get. This country loves guns, and just to give you a reference point, I could walk out of my building 2 blocks down, and I could buy a firearm for $100, $150. Does it have a body? The big deal is, does it have the numbers on the gun, and does it have a body attached? You don't want those kind of things. So, but yeah, I could go out of my building and go to the right and walk down 3 blocks and buy a fucking AK-47 if I wanted to. So that's how easy it is to buy a weapon. So I don't think mob guys have any problems getting their hands on that. Okay, this is a good question. Eleso Rosanto. When John Gotti hit Paul Castellano, why was Tommy Gambino not killed, and how was the murder explained to him? Well, first of all, I don't think anything was explained to Tommy Gambino. Carlo never wanted his son that deeply involved. He never wanted any of his children that deeply involved in the mob. Tommy was handed a lot of, he dealt with the garment district a whole lot. He dealt with a lot of white-collar stuff. He was not very powerful. A lot of people think he was powerful, but he really, at the end of the day, he was a lot like his father. And he also lived in his father's shadow, which must have been incredibly fucking hard for him. But he just never, he wasn't that guy. John Gotti didn't need to explain a fucking word to him. And pretty much everybody just kind of fell in line. But I had a question, considering that they were cousins. But I don't think that it was a bond that was so tight that Tommy Gambino thought for a second he was going to take on John Gotti and everybody else. It just wasn't going to happen. Tommy was put on the back burner a long time before John Gotti came along. He was only going to go so far. He was handed a lot of rackets to keep him busy, but he was never really considered, at least from what I've read. And now, so this is not my opinion, but I sort of got the impression that he wasn't the brightest crown in the box. Highly smart financially in some of the rackets, but at the end of the day, he wasn't like super IQ smart, and his father didn't want him doing a whole lot. So that's why it was never bothered to be explained. He's not going to fight nobody. He's lying like everybody else. Because the minute his father left, his father passed away, Tommy was never going to be the boss of that family, and I think he knew that from the time he was very young. So it's no surprise to me that nobody had to explain anything to him. Chris Atkinson, aside from Roy Demeo, who else belonged to the Gaji crew, and did any of them make close to Roy's earnings? Did Nino have a social club? Nino did not have a social club. Nino hung out at the Ravenite Social Club. That was his hangout. That's where he liked to be. He didn't want to have his own place. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, so he just kind of hung out where everybody else did. As far as Roy Demeo crew, I mean, Christ, Dominic Montiglio, he made a lot of money, but he was also trafficking drugs. Anthony Center, Joey Testa. Anthony Center was the real car thief of the bunch. He really had to steal cars. He was stealing cars at a young age, I think as early as 12, 13, or 14. His family also owned a car crushing business. So, he really made a lot of money. They all made a lot of money with Roy. Roy didn't pinch the quarter till the eagle screamed. He was very generous with the guys that worked for him. Who was it? Chris Rosenberg made a lot of money, but once again, it was drug trafficking. So the guys that were involved in his crew, even Henry Borelli, made a lot of who they called Dirty Henry, which is a hilarious nickname. But yeah, they all made a lot of money. Did they all make as much as Roy? No, because Roy was effectively the capo of that crew. Underneath, Nino oversaw that crew. So they all made incredible amounts of money together. So, but I don't think anybody made as much as Roy did. But keep in mind, everything flows up. Everything flows up. David Fitzgerald, do you think Tom and Brantley Henley worked directly for Tony Spilotro? No, I don't think they did. I think what and for those that don't know, they were Las Vegas hitmen. Tony Spilotro used a lot of different people. Tony Spilotro was incredibly under the wire, incredibly under the FBI's watch in Las Vegas. He couldn't get away with a whole lot, so he would subcontract guys out, and that's effectively what they were. They were subcontracted hitmen, and Spilotro could get them for free, and in exchange, he'd knock off some diamonds for them. They also did some stuff with the Hole in the Wall gang as well, which they would bust into jewelry stores and rob stuff. But they were not. They didn't directly work for him. They were sort of loaned to Spilotro and loaned out to other people, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, how does I think David Fitzgerald asked this one too. How does Mo Dalitz compare to Meyer Lansky in terms of influence and power? Mo Dalitz was Las Vegas. Meyer Lansky was the inventor of Vegas. A lot of people say that was Bugsy Siegel's idea. It really wasn't. It was Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel came together, but most importantly, it was Meyer Lansky's money that funded Las Vegas. It may have been directly, originally, Bugsy Siegel's idea, but he needed somebody to fund it, and the New York mob was kind of on the shelf about it. They didn't, a place out in the desert where you gamble, they were unsure of it, but Meyer Lansky thought it was a great idea. Cuban thing had worked, so Lansky was really the financial backer to that, and then once Lansky throws in a lot of money, the mob sort of comes along and says, okay, well, we'll do this too. If Meyer's going to do it, we'll do it too. Ultimately, it gets Bugsy Siegel killed, but it was Mo Dalitz, influence-wise, no. Because Mo Dalitz couldn't do a fucking thing in Las Vegas without Meyer Lansky and the mob allowing him to do it. Meyer Lansky had such power that he was effectively able to say something and it's done. He had an incredible amount of respect from everyone, and the mob backed him financially, and they backed him really on everything that he wanted to do because he made them an incredible amount of money. So without Meyer Lansky, there is no Mo Dalitz, but Mo Dalitz had a lot of power too in Las Vegas. He was somebody not to fuck with, but at the end of the day, I don't think he had as much power as Lansky because Lansky just didn't power in Las Vegas. Lansky had power everywhere. Canada, Europe, here, Florida, the South, Louisiana, New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Maine, Connecticut. He had power everywhere he went. So he had more influence and power, and that's the different comparison. Mo Dalitz was Vegas and Chicago, and effectively Meyer Lansky did what he wanted. Mo Dalitz was put there. So that would sort of explain that one. Okay, last question of the evening, and it's basically about Longy's Wellman and who shot him. Or what ended up happening is shot him. I'm thinking of somebody else. Longy's Wellman was a racketeer, et cetera, and a gangster, and a very well-known gangster in New Jersey. And effectively, there's always been this long-standing sort of rumor that he didn't kill himself, that he was hung. Effectively, and I'm going to go through it a little bit here, but effectively there's always been the long-standing thing of was he killed or did he actually kill himself? So let's understand kind of how that came to be. Longy's Wellman sort of begins in his youth. He starts selling lottery tickets, which was a bigger moneymaker than working in a grocery store, and that eventually enabled him to sort of control the numbers rackets. As Prohibition began, he starts smuggling whiskey into New Jersey via Canada, using World War armored trucks. Later, he ends up joining a syndicate headed by Joe Renfield, which enables him to use ships instead of trucks, so he could move a lot more bulk. We saw the same thing in Costello, the Big Seven that we talked about last week. Then with the profits from the bootlegging, he begins to expand into gambling, prostitution, and labor racketeering. And effectively, when Dutch Schultz gets killed in 1935, Wellman takes over all of his rackets. He eventually gets into politics, and he takes over the majority of politicians in Newark, New Jersey, and that lasts for about 20 years. So he had a lot of political power and took over all of Schultz's rackets. Then during the 1940s, he partners with Willie Moretti, and they cornered the market on gambling operations in New Jersey. They pretty much owned all the gambling in Jersey. In 1951, the Kefauver hearings begin, and he's called to testify, and he admits he's a bootlegger, but he denies everything else. Then in 1956, he ends up getting tried for tax evasion, which he ends up getting away with. The other people that were indicted with him all got caught. He didn't, and that has a lot to do with financial and political donations that he made, and so that was fixed. But then in 1959, shit happens. It's the McClellan hearings begin, which obviously we all know was the nice crime, and he was issued a subpoena. But the problem was, before he could go to the hearing, he's found dead. The death was ruled a suicide. He ended up actually hanging himself at his home. But the reason why there were questions was because there were bruises found on his wrist as if he tied up prior to that. Some say Vito Genovese had wanted him dead because Genovese wanted to corner the market on the gambling in New Jersey. Some say Meyer Lansky called for it. Nobody really knows for sure. Then a couple of years before Luciano dies, he's talking to an author named Martin Gosch, sort of Luciano's biography before the mob threatened to kill Luciano. Don't you goddamn dare write that book, or there's going to be problems. He tells Martin Gosch that Zwillman was effectively killed and murdered because the mob was afraid. They were deathly afraid that he would open up his mouth and talk. And so effectively, he's whacked. Well, he gets, murdered or whatever, and then the rackets are split, obviously, the Cavalcantes and the rest of the crime families in New York. So that's what I believe happened. I believe he was murdered. I have no doubts about that. I think that's just the reality of that situation. So there were a couple more questions that we did have that I just didn't get time to. I wish I could have gone into more depth, but I'm really slated for a time crunch right as we speak because I have another pending thing I have to take care of. But we are going to continue the Q&As. I do not mind, once again, accepting personal questions. You can ask me anything personal. The only thing I can't comment on is, obviously, there's a lawsuit going on I can't comment on. But there is one question here. I guess I can sort of answer this. Marty Claire, would you at any point consider interviewing someone who's an informant such as Michael Francis, Billy Cutolo Jr., Dominic Montegolo, Jimmy Calandra, and would you ever have someone from the Gotti family on your radio show like Junior, if he would even do it, Angel, Victoria, or Peter? Okay. So I've long said that there is no going to have an informant on my show ever again. I've been down this route. It caused me a lot of grief, caused me a lot of problems. But I understand that the average person who doesn't know a lot about Cosa Nostra wouldn't mind hearing a story from an informant. The issue that I have with it, and what I have said before, I told Frank Ganji this, I told a lot of other people, if you're gonna do my radio show, and this was prior till I made this rule, that if you're gonna do my radio show, anything you tell me, you better fucking back up and send in a court document first, because I'm not gonna deal with this guy saying X and O about such and such, and then me turning around a week later finding out it's all bullshit and he lied. I'm not, because I don't want my listeners to get a skewed version of events. Sure, if it's an opinion and they said, look, here's my opinion, this is the way I feel like it sort of went down, this is why I had to do, that's one thing, and I don't have a problem with that. But Jimmy Calandras, I'm not interested in. Frank Ganji, maybe, but I just don't have the vested interest in letting someone who told on everybody they ever grew up with, giving them an outlet for that. You shouldn't be rewarded for that, and that's just my opinion. As far as anybody from the Gotti family, first of all, Junior doesn't do fucking radio interviews. If he did, that would be something down the line, but that's not something that I see that's A, going to be feasible, B, is it something I would ever ask. I think he's a little busy. I think he's trying to move on with his life, and I don't think it makes a whole hell of a lot of sense for him to come on my show and talk about the old days. I just think he has better things to do. That's my opinion. As far as Victoria or Peter's not involved in that life at all. Peter's got his own stuff going on. I don't even know Peter, so I don't see how that would specifically be relevant. Victoria doesn't do interviews really, other than major stuff. I do, maybe possibly, back and forth. I think Angel Gotti is going to do my show, but it's a timing thing, and let me just put it this way. Details are like very slow working out. I think she wants to do it, but there's like parameters that are involved. And when I say parameters, it has nothing to do with can she talk, can she not talk. It has to do with, they've got a movie coming out. She's incredibly busy. They've got the documentary coming out. And really, you don't want to come and do a radio show and step on the projects that are coming very soon and sort of ruin it for people. So, we have to, if that's something that is going to lend itself to me, or if that's something that is going to happen, or if that's something that has been discussed, because I'm not going to confirm nor deny that has been discussed in depth, it's probably going to be after those things come out, only because naturally it makes more sense. But who knows? If Angel's around and she wants to do it, I'll definitely do it. I think the perspective would be pretty interesting. I think it would be interesting to hear John Gotti's daughter talk about her father in a way that the average public needs to see. But also that A&E documentary that I believe is coming out in January. And trust me, I will be corrected if I'm wrong about that. But I think if you guys watch this documentary, this is a large part documentary that's coming out, you're going to see a lot of stuff and hear a lot of stuff that's absolutely incredible. Now, I'm not saying I have any inside information, because I really fucking don't at the end of the day. Everything is like cloaked in secrecy about stuff like this. But one thing I can tell you that was told to me was that this was no holds barred, 100% unequivocally the truth, and they allowed access to their lives like no one else has ever been given. So if you're interested in the Gotti family, or John Gotti, or Angel, John Gotti Jr., or anybody else, then you're definitely going to want to tune into A&E for that, because that's going to be really special. And then, obviously, the Gotti film would be coming out sometime, either before that or during that or after that. I'm not even sure. I can't remember what the date is. I think it was like December 15th is the date of the film. So look forward to those kind of things. But I hope that answers your question. It's not that I'm going to be like tongue-in-cheek or hide anything. It's just I don't really know. I don't have a yes or a no. I have that's something I would probably consider doing, but everything is timing, and everything is set up in a certain way. So, all that being said, we do have a bunch of other guests that are coming, but like I said, I got to stagger this, and I also have litigation going on. So, I've got to be focused on certain things before I can be focused on others, and that's just the way it goes. So, I wanted to thank everybody for submitting questions. If I didn't get to your question, you can hunt me down and threaten me, complain, do whatever it is you guys do, but I will try to get to your question next time. I wanted to thank everybody for participating. David Fitzgerald, John Laru, these are guys that are always asking great questions. Robert Wilkins, a good friend of mine. A lot of you write excellent questions. I'm very impressed with the questions. High IQ listenership. I love that too. Anyway, that's it for this week's Q&A. We will probably do another Q&A in probably 2 weeks, I would imagine. But for future reference, if you want to get in contact with me, I will discuss anything with you directly. Hit me up at Twitter at RealMobTalk7. Check me out on Facebook. Type in Mob Talk Radio. Inbox me there. Jeff Canarsie is my regular Facebook page. Oh, yeah, that was a question I need to address. A lot of people friend request me on my regular Facebook page, which is my personal page with people I've known my whole life. I do accept friend requests. However, if you friend request me, I'm going to vet you, and I'm going to look at your page, and if you have 5 friends, I'm going to start wondering who the fuck you are. You got to understand that when this social media fiasco between the Gottis and John A. Light sort of began, which is somewhat ongoing, there's a lot of fake accounts, and people make fake accounts so they can accost me, or they can accost Angel, or accost whoever. That's just how people function on social media, unfortunately. So I'm very careful and very picky about who I allow. So if you send me a friend request and I deny it, chances are it's just because I smacked the button and I just didn't even look. But I generally try not to add anybody to my personal page just because that's my personal life. But if you are one of the lucky ones that I do accept, then congratulations. You are one of the lucky few. So thanks for submitting the questions, and we will be back in 2 weeks as far as the Q&A goes. And then tomorrow, the one and only Angelo Bruno. Thanks for submitting the questions. Everybody have a good night, and we will definitely be talking to you tomorrow during the Angelo Bruno Show.